What is the purpose behind laws? Often people think about laws and they kind of think about them as a burden on their own personal freedom. I mean, after all, why can't I drive 90 miles an hour since I'm a good driver? I mean, who's going to be harmed? And we might legitimize it by asking those kinds of questions. Of course, if we could just get beyond our own narcissism, we would know that such behavior can be dangerous to innocent people. So we have laws, and these laws set boundaries, and they forbid dangerous behavior. Ultimately, I suggest laws should protect others and benefit society. Now, if we truly looked out for one another, there would be little need for laws. But we tend to look out for ourselves, and we forget how things we do might impact someone else. So laws become a necessity. God has given us laws. I always talk about how we should think about the Ten Commandments as boundaries. And if we get outside those boundaries, we can cause harm to ourselves and to others. But inside these boundaries, we can enjoy life fully. Sadly, though, we get so hung up on the law itself that the law kind of becomes our idols, and it becomes a weapon that we can use to push agendas that may have nothing to do with the purpose or the original purpose behind the law. And we're going to see that in today's text. Now, we've begun working our way through Mark's Gospel, and in the past couple of months, we have seen a kind of a parallel track of events happening. On the positive side, people are excited by what they hear from Jesus. They are in awe of his power as he heals the sick, as he frees those possessed by demons. And the word gets around. And Jesus can't go anywhere anymore without a crowd gathering. But that's a positive thing, because people, they know Jesus is bringing this fresh perspective as to how they might relate to one another and to God. But as the crowd grows, so does the opposition to Jesus' ministry. At first, as we saw, it was the evil spirits or the demons. And then came the scribes. And as we saw last week, the Pharisees. And next week, just to give you a little preview, as we end this section in Mark's Gospel, we see that the Pharisees are willing to make a pact with evil in order to do away with Jesus. Of course, they won't be able to accomplish that goal right away. It won't be until much later. But the seeds are sown early in the 3rd chapter of Mark that leads to Jesus' crucifixion. Another thing we hear in today's reading is what Jesus teaches, because so far in the previous encounters that we had in Mark with Jesus and the crowds and Jesus and individuals, we are told that Jesus has been teaching, but we're never told what he says. Mark doesn't give us details. Instead, we just see and are witness to the power of Jesus. But now Mark, in his proclamation of Jesus Christ as the Messiah, tells us some of what Jesus taught. Jesus uses parables and stories and draws upon the Old Testament to convey his message. Now, I'm combining two stories today. They could be broken apart, and I could have done two different sermons, but they kind of parallel each other, so I decided to put them together. Besides, if I preached on each section separately in Mark's Gospel, that's like each 4 or 5 verses, I don't think we would get through Mark during 2024. So listen now as I read God's Word, preaching from Mark, the 2nd chapter, beginning with the 18th verse. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the bridegroom is with them, can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak. Otherwise the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins." One Sabbath, as he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our text begins with Mark introducing to us John's disciples. That John, like Jesus, had disciples. And these disciples, like John, lived the life of a religious ascetic. They forego much of life's pleasure. And from what we can find out in the other Gospels, they abstained from alcoholic drinks, and they only ate what was necessary to sustain life. In Luke's Gospel, we read of Jesus saying, "For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he is a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." In our text this morning, and from the one I just read from Luke, we see that Jesus is kind of in a catch-22 position. I mean, he faces a paradox and one he can't win. Of course, Jesus was no glutton or drunkard, but neither was he a religious ascetic like John and his disciples. Jesus just can't please those in powerful positions. And by the way, I think this is by design. By having such silly no-win games, those in power are able to better maintain control over everyone else. Now, many of the Pharisees fasted twice a week. I mean, they wanted to be seen as being good. They wanted to be seen as over and above everyone else. Two things should be noticed here. First, Jewish law only required a yearly fast on the Day of Atonement or the Day of Yom Kippur. Other fasts could be called, such as during a time of national calamity, but nowhere does the law require the frequent fast as called for by the Pharisees and obviously also practiced by John and his disciples. Second, regular and frequent fasting was a requirement that's totally made up by the Pharisees. And they have done this as a way to display their spirituality. They do this because they want others to see that they are holy. Jesus addresses this in the Sermon on the Mount, telling them that they have received their rewards because everybody has seen just how holy they appear, as he encourages his followers to pray and to fast privately. Jesus is not against fasting, but he is against pride. And perhaps there is nothing more dangerous than religious pride. When we think we are right, we can be fooled into ignoring the obvious. Jesus then uses three analogies to make his point, and the first is that of a wedding. No one would think of fasting at a wedding feast. In those days, these celebrations would go for a week, and they would include a lot of food and drink and entertainment. And those who were lucky enough to be invited to these wedding feasts, to these parties, were to enjoy themselves. That was the only purpose for them being there. Now, while Jesus doesn't say that he's the bridegroom in the text, I think it's implied. He'll use this analogy again in a parable found in Matthew's Gospel when he speaks about his return and those who are waiting for the bridegroom's return. And later, the risen Christ is seen as the bridegroom to the church. While Jesus is with the disciples, though, he's saying they need to enjoy his company. Then Jesus hints at what will happen later, because there will become a time that the disciples will fast, but that's when he's gone. Of course, those who were hearing what Jesus was talking about here when it happened would not have known, as we know, that Jesus will be crucified. Yes, there will come a time that he is not there with the disciples. Now, the second and third parables given here deal with common household examples. You don't sew on a piece of unstruck fabric onto old cloth because it will shrink, and when it shrinks, it's going to tear the fabric again. Nor do you put new wine into old wineskins because the fermentation process is going to cause that wine to swell, and those skins that have already been stretched out will then break. So you use a new wine skin. Jesus is doing something new. He's launching a new paradigm. He needs new wineskins for his message to go in, something fresh. Now, this story about fasting is followed on its heels with a story dealing with Sabbath. As with fasting, the Sabbath laws have been added to over the years, so that by the time Jesus comes around, they've really become a burden to the people. The disciples were out walking, and by the way, if they walked too far, they were breaking the Sabbath. And they went through a grain field, and they're hungry, and they pulled off some of the seeds to eat. By the way, going through somebody's grain field and pulling off seeds to eat was actually allowed. That wasn't considered theft. Now, they could not take the sickle to the grain field. In other words, they couldn't harvest the grain, but they could take what they needed to eat. I mean, that's actually a way to handle the issues of hunger in a day that you did not have fast food restaurants and such. But the problem here is taking the grain on the Sabbath. harvesting and perhaps grinding it in their hands and then eating it. Jesus responds to this accusation. He doesn't deny it, but he responds to it by recalling a story from the time of David about how he and his men ate bread that had been set aside for the priest. Even in the Old Testament, you were allowed to do certain things on the Sabbath for the safety of others, for your own health. But the Pharisees, to drive a wedge between Jesus and his followers accused them of breaking the Sabbath laws. Jesus ends his response with a reminder of the Sabbath's purpose. It was made for us. We were not made for it. Again, as I said earlier about good laws, they're for our well-being. How can we take care of ourselves and others? When the law becomes a way to show or to prove our holiness, we have it all wrong. Last Sunday I spoke about how Christians should have joy in our lives. Unnecessary laws help those in power maintain power, but they strip us of joy. As followers of Jesus, we are ultimately to follow two laws: loving God and loving others. When we impose additional religious regulations arbitrarily, then we're no better than the morality police of Iran, running around, imposing their strict interpretation of the Quran, while beating those they see as inferior. But the Christian faith is not to be a faith about rules. It's a faith built on a relationship to God through the Son. And that relationship is to lead us into other relationships as we accept God's grace in our own lives and as we extend such grace to others. While the law is important, for it helps us to see our sinfulness and it guides us as we strive for godliness, it should never overpower our grace. Mark wants us to understand that Jesus is doing something new and that we should rejoice in such freedom. Amen.